The Mitsubishi A6M0 had always been a weapon without mercy. On the morning of July 30th, 1942, it became something else entirely, a messenger of truth that neither Tokyo nor London had anticipated. Warrant Officer Shoji Nishimura was not a defector by nature. He was a precision instrument himself, trained since childhood to obey without question, to die without hesitation. 23 years old, with 47 confirmed aerial victories over the Pacific, he represented everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had engineered. Loyalty crystallized into lethal efficiency. His hands bore the calluses of a man who had gripped control sticks through impossible maneuvers. His eyes held the stillness of someone who had watched enemies fall from the sky so many times that death became a routine report filed at dusk. On that morning, over the Aleutian Islands, something fractured inside the machinery. Nishimura's Zero had sustained damage during an interception mission near Dutch Harbor. Not catastrophic, the engine still sang its familiar metallic song. The airframe held its structure, but enough. A fuel leak, slow and persistent, had begun its work. He calculated silently as he flew. Mathematical certainty told him he would not reach home. The mathematics of war left no room for sentiment, only for decisions. Return to base was impossible. Ditching in hostile waters meant death by cold and drowning. There remained only one option, the one that no pilot was meant to consider. He descended toward the British outpost at Pemberton Airfield, Unalaska Island. The British officers watching the radar blips that morning thought it was a malfunction. A single Japanese fighter descending without evasion, without the erratic patterns of combat engagement. When the Zero touched down on the runway, wheels down, flaps extended, descent angle controlled, the airfield commander, Wing Commander James Whitmore, stood frozen on the tarmac. Nishimura climbed from the cockpit with his hands visible, his flight suit darkened with sweat and hydraulic fluid, his face a mask of absolute resignation. "I am Warrant Officer Shoji Nishimura," he said in careful, accented English. "I surrender myself and my aircraft. I wish to provide intelligence." The silence that followed lasted 7 seconds. 7 seconds that would ripple across the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. Within hours, Nishimura sat in a secure interrogation room at Pemberton. The British intelligence officers could not believe what they were hearing, not because he was lying. His knowledge was too specific, too technical, too utterly precise to be fabrication. They could not believe it because what he was describing rendered obsolete every tactical assumption the Allied air forces had built their strategy upon. The Mitsubishi A6M0, the aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies for nearly 3 years, was not the invulnerable weapon everyone believed. Its speed came from a design philosophy that sacrificed armor and structural redundancy. Its maneuverability came from weight reduction that left it vulnerable to high-speed dives and sustained G-forces. Its range advantage was real, but it came at a cost. The fuel system was fragile, the cockpit protection minimal, the engine prone to overheating under sustained combat stress. More critically, Nishimura provided the complete technical specifications: engine displacement, compression ratios, maximum altitude ratings, fuel consumption curves, armament placement, vulnerability points. He drew diagrams from memory with the precision of a man who had memorized every rivet and cable. He described tactics, training protocols, the psychological breaking points of pilots under sustained combat operations. He spoke of exhaustion among Japanese squadrons, of pilot losses that could not be replaced, of a production infrastructure already showing signs of strain. The documents were photographed, encoded and transmitted to London within 24 hours. By August 3rd, The technical analysis had reached the RAF's Fighter Development Division. By August 15th, it had reached American commanders in the Pacific. The impact was immediate and transformative. Allied aircraft designers suddenly understood not what they had to match, but what they could exploit. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, already in production, could be optimized for the very tactics that would destroy Zeros. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning could operate at combat profiles that would stress the Zero beyond its design limits. Shoji Nishimura was moved to a secure facility in northern Scotland. For the remainder of the war, he lived in a cell that was more comfortable than a prison, but undeniably a cage. He was treated with formal courtesy, never abused, never tortured. He was simply kept, a living encyclopedia locked away until the war concluded. He never knew the full impact of his decision. He never knew that the intelligence he provided would contribute to the tactical shift that would gradually, inexorably, turn the air war in favor of the Allies. What he knew was silence, years of silence. The war ended. Japan surrendered. Nishimura remained in Scotland, his existence classified, his name erased from official records. He had committed the ultimate sin against his nation. He had given its secrets to the enemy. He could never go home. In 1948, 3 years after the war's end, a single sentence appeared in a declassified British intelligence summary. Source Kasuga provided technical data of considerable strategic value. No name, no acknowledgement, no recognition of the man who had chosen survival and truth over loyalty and death. The war ended, but for one Japanese pilot, the real silence was only beginning. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel, and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. The interrogation room at Pemberton had been designed with a specific philosophy: comfort as a weapon. No harsh lighting, no metal tables, no visible instruments of coercion. Instead, soft afternoon light filtered through reinforced windows. A wooden desk, papers arranged with meticulous order, a chair positioned to suggest conversation rather than accusation. The British understood something the Japanese did not. A man who had already made the choice to surrender could be broken far more effectively through acknowledgement than through denial. Flight Lieutenant Robert Ashford had been conducting high-level prisoner interviews since 1940. He spoke Japanese fluently, learned not in Oxford, but in Shanghai, in the years before the war had consumed everything. He understood the psychology of Japanese officers, the shame of capture, the cognitive dissonance between training and reality, the desperate hunger for someone to simply listen without judgment. Nishimura sat across from him on the morning of August 2nd, 1942. He had not slept. His uniform had been cleaned, returned to him, a small gesture that seemed to acknowledge his rank, despite his status as a prisoner. Ashford placed a cup of tea between them, not as interrogator and subject, but as two professionals meeting to discuss technical matters. "You understand," Ashford began in precise Japanese, "that what you have told us cannot be unknown. The information exists now. The question is not whether we will use it, but how we will use it. Your cooperation from this point determines whether your sacrifice has meaning or becomes merely another casualty of war." Nishimura's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the teacup. This was the trap, he understood, not the interrogation itself, but the recognition that his choice had consequences he could no longer control. He'd surrendered his aircraft and his knowledge. Now they were extracting something deeper, the technical minutiae that only a pilot who had flown the Zero in combat could provide. For 6 hours, Ashford and 2 American aeronautical engineers questioned him. They wanted to know about the engine's behavior under different atmospheric conditions. At what altitude did fuel consumption increase? Under what G-force loads did the airframe begin to show stress fractures? What was the pilot's field of vision in a steep dive? How long could the engine sustain maximum RPM before overheating became critical? What was the actual service ceiling versus the theoretical maximum? Nishimura answered with the precision of a man describing his own body to a surgeon. He had not thought in these abstract terms before. He had simply flown, reacted, survived. But now, forced to articulate the machine's intimate vulnerabilities, he realized something that military training had obscured. The Zero was not invincible. It was a compromise, like all weapons, between competing demands: speed versus protection, range versus firepower, maneuverability versus structural integrity. "The Thunderbolt," he said, his English halting but clear. "It is heavier, yes, but this heaviness, it allows it to dive faster than we can follow. The Zero cannot match a vertical dive without the engine failing. The airframe will not sustain the stress. This is not a secret to keep hidden anymore." Ashford and the American engineers exchanged glances. This single observation would reshape tactical doctrine. They had theorized about it, suspected it based on combat reports, but hearing it confirmed by a pilot who had flown the Zero through dozens of engagements transformed suspicion into operational certainty. By August 4th, the first technical summary had been prepared. Photographs of the Zero's engine components were being analyzed at Rolls-Royce facilities. The airframe specifications were being compared against American fighter designs. The tactical implications were being distributed to squadron commanders across the Pacific theater. But the interrogation continued day after day, week after week. Not all questions were technical. Ashford began to probe deeper into the psychology of Japanese pilots, the training regimen, the selection criteria, the attrition rates. "How many pilots like you were there?" Ashford asked on the 8th day. Nishimura hesitated. This was no longer technical specification. This was strategic intelligence about pilot reserves. "We lose more than we replace," Nishimura said quietly. "This is the truth that Tokyo will not acknowledge. In 1941, we had pilots with experience. Now, in 1942, we have pilots with only training. The experienced pilots die. The new pilots are not ready, and we cannot pause production to train more. The war demands constant replacement." This was the intelligence that mattered most. Not the machine specifications, but the human reality beneath them. The Japanese military had gambled on a quick victory. When that gamble failed, the attrition rate for experienced pilots became catastrophic. The Zero was being flown increasingly by men with fewer than 50 hours of combat experience, against Allied pilots with hundreds of hours of experience accumulated over years of continuous warfare. Ashford documented every word. By mid-August, the analysis was complete. The air war in the Pacific would be won not by technological superiority, but by pilot attrition. The Allies had the industrial capacity and the training infrastructure to replace losses. Japan did not. The Zero's technical advantages meant nothing if the pilot flying it had insufficient experience to exploit them. Nishimura sat in his cell that evening, aware that he had provided not just aircraft specifications, but the blueprint of his nation's eventual defeat. He had not betrayed Japan with a single act of surrender. He had betrayed it through dozens of hours of honest answers to technical questions, each response a small wound in the armor of strategic secrecy. The tea had gone cold on the interrogation room desk. It was never refilled. Nishimura would not be asked to sit at that desk again. The interrogation phase was complete. Now came the waiting, years of it, in rooms with soft light and careful courtesy, locked away while the war fought itself to conclusion above his head. In the Pacific, Allied pilots began to adjust their tactics. The next Zero they encountered would be attacked differently. Not in the turning fight where the Japanese excelled, but in the vertical battle where American aircraft had the advantage. Shoji Nishimura would never see combat again, but his enemies would. By October 1942, the implications of Nishimura's intelligence had cascaded through the entire Allied Air Command structure. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, at bases across the Pacific, at RAF facilities in India and Burma, pilots received new briefing documents. The documents did not mention sources or names. They simply presented tactical data as if it had been derived from accumulated combat experience. "The Zero's turning radius is superior," the briefing read, "but this superiority comes at a cost. The aircraft cannot sustain high-speed dives without structural stress. Engage the Zero in vertical maneuvers. Force the engagement into the regime where the Thunderbolt and Lightning excel." The pilots who received this briefing did not know that these words had come from a Japanese pilot sitting in an interrogation room in Scotland. They thought it was tactical wisdom, hard-won through combat losses. In a sense, it was. But it was wisdom purchased with betrayal, documented by a man who had surrendered not just his aircraft, but the intimate technical secrets of his nation. The first engagement, where the new tactics were systematically applied, occurred on October 26, 1942, during the naval battle near Santa Cruz. American F-4F Wildcat pilots, flying aircraft that had previously been considered inferior to the Zero, engaged Japanese fighters with a new doctrine: never turn with the Zero. Never allow the engagement to develop in the horizontal plane where Japanese maneuverability dominated. Instead, climb, dive, force the Japanese into vertical combat where American aircraft had structural advantages. The results were immediate. In previous months, the ratio of kills had favored Japanese pilots, often 3 or 4 to 1. In October and November, that ratio began to compress. Japanese pilots found themselves unable to shake American pursuers in high-speed dives. American aircraft that had previously seemed clumsy and disadvantaged suddenly demonstrated capabilities that had not been apparent before. By December 1942, the shift was undeniable. The air superiority that Japan had held for nearly 2 years was beginning to erode. Not because American aircraft had become fundamentally superior, many Japanese pilots still flew better machines, but because Allied pilots now understood the precise limitations of those machines and had developed tactics to exploit them. In bases across the Pacific, pilots began to achieve kill ratios that had seemed impossible 6 months earlier. The change was subtle enough that it appeared to be the result of accumulated experience and improved tactics. No one, outside a handful of intelligence officers and high-level commanders, knew that the foundation of this tactical revolution had been laid by a single Japanese pilot who had decided that survival and truth mattered more than loyalty. At the interrogation facility in Scotland, Nishimura watched the months pass. He was not informed of the results of his cooperation. The British Intelligence Service maintained strict compartmentalization. Prisoners were not told how their information was being used. In theory, this prevented them from deriving satisfaction from betrayal or from calculating future betrayals. In practice, it meant that Nishimura lived in complete uncertainty about whether his sacrifice had meant anything at all. He was moved in January 1943 to a more secure location, a country estate in the Scottish Highlands, converted into a secure facility for high-value prisoners. The facility housed a rotating population of German scientists, Italian officers, and Japanese personnel. Nishimura was kept separate, his status too sensitive for general population housing. The facility commander, Major Thomas Weatherby, maintained meticulous records of all prisoner interactions. Nishimura's file noted his cooperation, his technical competence, his apparent remorse. But there was another notation, one that appeared in the margin of a 1943 security review. Subject demonstrates signs of psychological deterioration, recommended for therapeutic engagement. D. The therapeutic engagement took the form of carefully supervised reading materials, technical journals, historical texts, philosophical works in both Japanese and English. Weatherby believed that a prisoner's mental state was a strategic asset. A prisoner who lost his will entirely became useless. A prisoner who maintained some sense of purpose, even in captivity, remained a potentially valuable asset for future intelligence operations. By spring 1943, Nishimura had become something neither Japanese nor British, a ghost caught between two identities, his original nationality rendered impossible by his betrayal, his new status as a prisoner of war incomplete because his cooperation had transcended the typical bounds of military detention. He was neither enemy nor ally, neither free nor condemned. He existed in a legal and psychological void that only war could create. At RAF bases across Southeast Asia, pilots continued to exploit the tactical advantages that Nishimura's intelligence had provided. The Japanese pilots they faced had become increasingly experienced, the surviving veterans of the 2-year air campaign, but they were fewer in number and fighting with diminishing industrial support. The attrition rate that Nishimura had identified in his interrogation session proved to be accurate. Japan could not replace its losses in experienced pilots, and the gap in pilot quality was widening with each month that passed. By mid-1943, the air war had fundamentally shifted. Japanese fighter squadrons were being assigned pilots with as little as 30 hours of combat experience. American and British squadrons were rotating experienced pilots home to train the next generation, ensuring a pipeline of increasingly competent replacements. The technological advantages of individual aircraft mattered less and less as the cumulative effect of training, experience, and tactical doctrine compounded. In the Scottish Highlands, Nishimura read the technical journals that were provided to him. He saw references to new American fighters, new tactics, new strategic concepts. He did not know with certainty that his intelligence had contributed to any of it, but he could read between the lines of the careful, neutral technical language and understand that something had changed in the Pacific War. The machines were evolving, but the real evolution was in how they were being used. On a cold afternoon in April 1943, Major Weatherby sat across from Nishimura in a small study room within the facility. "The war will be won by either side within the next 2 to 3 years, Weatherby said in careful English. "That is my assessment, and I believe it is accurate. When it ends, there will be an accounting. People will ask who provided what information and to whom. Your name will not appear in any document. Your sacrifice will not be acknowledged. This is how intelligence work functions. But I want you to know, personally, that your cooperation has had strategic consequences. The Allies have been able to adjust their tactics based on your technical knowledge. Fewer of our pilots will die because you chose to speak honestly." Nishimura said nothing. He did not know if Weatherby was telling the truth or simply employing a psychological technique to maintain compliance. He did not know if his intelligence had genuinely changed the trajectory of the war, or if it was simply one fragment among thousands of intelligence pieces that cumulatively formed a strategy. What he knew was that he could not go home. That certainty was absolute. If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. By 1944, Shoji Nishimura had become something unprecedented in the history of the Pacific War. A living piece of obsolete intelligence, kept alive and secure, not because his information remained tactically relevant, but because his existence itself had become classified. To release him would require explaining who he was, what he had provided, and why he had been kept in a secure facility for nearly 2 years. The bureaucratic machinery of military secrecy had its own momentum. It was easier to continue his detention than to justify his release. The facility in the Scottish Highlands had become something closer to a research institute than a prison. Nishimura was permitted to work, not as a prisoner, but as a technical consultant. The British military's Aeronautical Research Division had questions about the Zero that went beyond the initial interrogation. How would the airframe respond to certain stress loads? What modifications might improve performance? How would the engine behave under specific atmospheric conditions? These were theoretical questions now. The Zero was already becoming obsolete, outpaced by newer American and British fighters, but the process of understanding the machine's capabilities had value independent of immediate tactical application. In a sense, Nishimura became a teacher, instructing British engineers in the aeronautical logic that had produced the Zero, the compromises and priorities that had shaped its design. He lived in a small cottage on the grounds of the facility, with sufficient freedom of movement within the secure perimeter to maintain a semblance of normalcy. He was permitted to write letters, though all correspondence was monitored and censored. Any reference to his location, his activities, or his intelligence cooperation was removed before the letters were sent. In June 1944, 6 months after D-Day, the war in Europe had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The war in the Pacific continued with brutal stalemate, island by island, as American forces moved inexorably toward Japan, but the technological gap between Allied and Japanese aircraft was widening with each month. The Hellcat, the Corsair, the Mustang, newer American fighters were achieving air superiority with increasing consistency. The intelligence that Nishimura had provided had contributed to this shift, though not in the way that might be imagined. The tactical advantages he had identified became the foundation for a doctrine that emphasized pilot training and aircraft performance optimization over individual aircraft design. American manufacturers focused on producing reliable, maintainable fighters that could be flown effectively by rotating pilots with varying levels of experience. Japanese manufacturers continued to pursue incremental improvements to existing designs, each iteration slightly faster, slightly more maneuverable, but each also more difficult to maintain and requiring more experienced pilots to operate effectively. By 1944, this strategic divergence had become decisive. American production capacity was overwhelming Japanese industrial output by a ratio of nearly 10-to-1. American pilot training programs were producing replacement pilots faster than Japanese losses could accumulate. The air war had become a mathematics problem, and the mathematics favored the Allies entirely. In the Scottish facility, Nishimura was aware that Japan was losing. The technical journals that he read contained enough information, properly interpreted, to make the trajectory clear. The war would not last another 2 years. The consensus among the intelligence officers and military personnel at the facility was that Japan would be defeated by 1945, certainly by 1946. No one told him that his own intelligence had contributed to this outcome. The compartmentalization of intelligence work was absolute. He was never informed that the tactical doctrine that had been revolutionized by his information had directly resulted in higher casualty rates for Japanese pilots and lower casualty rates for American pilots. He was never told that the air superiority campaign that had gradually ground Japan's air force into non-existence had been accelerated by the technical knowledge he had provided. In November 1944, Major Weatherby was reassigned. His replacement was a younger officer, Flight Lieutenant David Crawley, who had no personal connection to Nishimura and viewed the continued detention of a Japanese prisoner as an administrative burden rather than a strategic necessity. Crawley raised the question with his superiors. What was the purpose of maintaining this prisoner? The war was nearly won. Japan would be defeated within a year. Why continue to incur the cost of detention and security? The response came through channels of military bureaucracy that moved with glacial slowness. A file was opened at the War Office. Questions were raised and circulated. Should Nishimura be tried as a war criminal for providing military intelligence to the enemy? Should he be repatriated to Japan after the war? Should he be offered asylum in Britain or a neutral country? Should his existence be denied entirely? By March 1945, with Germany collapsing and Japan's military situation becoming desperate, the decision was made. Nishimura's status would remain classified. His continued detention would continue. No public acknowledgement of his existence or cooperation would be made. He was a secret that had served its purpose and would now be maintained indefinitely as a safeguard against future complications. In the cottage in the Scottish Highlands, Nishimura received word through subtle channels that the decision had been made. He would not be tried. He would not be released. He would remain indefinitely in a kind of suspended animation, neither prisoner nor guest, neither enemy nor ally. In April 1945, Germany surrendered. In May, victory in Europe was declared. Nishimura stood in the courtyard of the facility and watched British soldiers celebrate, their faces alight with the satisfaction of victory, with the prospect of going home. He understood with perfect clarity that he would never experience that satisfaction, that his home no longer existed for him in any meaningful sense. The war would end in a matter of weeks. Japan would surrender in August. But for Shoji Nishimura, the war had already ended 3 years earlier, on a runway in the Aleutian Islands, when he had chosen truth over loyalty and had discovered that truth was no less imprisoning than any physical chain. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across radio frequencies throughout the Pacific, announcing Japan's surrender. The war that had consumed 6 years of human history and tens of millions of lives had ended. In bases across the Pacific, soldiers wept. In cities across the world, celebrations erupted. In a secure facility in the Scottish Highlands, Shoji Nishimura listened to the announcement in Japanese, translated by a guard, and felt nothing. The surrender changed nothing for him. The war had ended, but his status remained unchanged. He remained in the cottage on the grounds, his movements restricted, his existence classified. The machinery of war had ceased, but the machinery of secrecy continued, sustained by its own bureaucratic momentum. By September 1945, the first waves of Japanese prisoners of war were being repatriated. Ships sailed from Europe and Asia, carrying hundreds of thousands of soldiers back to a defeated Japan, to a nation occupied and dismantled, to a future that existed only in uncertainty. Nishimura was not on these ships. His name did not appear on any manifest. His status as a prisoner of war had been rendered ambiguous by his cooperation. He was neither combatant, who could be simply repatriated, nor criminal, who could be tried. The classification of his file was elevated. Documents were moved to a secure archive at the War Office in London. The cottage in the Scottish Highlands, where he had lived for 3 years, was emptied. Nishimura was transferred to a facility in London, underground, beneath the Ministry of Defence building. The facility was smaller, more austere, designed for long-term detention of individuals whose status could not be publicly acknowledged. It housed perhaps a dozen prisoners, German scientists, Italian officers, Japanese personnel, all of whom existed in the same legal void. They could not be tried because their cooperation had made them too valuable. They could not be released because their knowledge was too sensitive. They existed in a liminal space, neither fully imprisoned nor truly free. Nishimura was assigned identification number 847. His name was removed from daily records. He became a file, a classification level, a bureaucratic necessity. In October 1945, Major, now Colonel Weatherby, before being demobilized, submitted a final report on the intelligence that Nishimura had provided. The report was marked "Most Secret, Eyes Only" and was filed away with instructions that it could not be declassified for at least 50 years. Weatherby documented the technical specifications that Nishimura had provided, the tactical implications that had resulted, and his assessment that the intelligence had contributed materially to the shift in air superiority that had favored the Allies in the Pacific. The report concluded with a single paragraph. Subject 847 has demonstrated consistent cooperation and truthfulness throughout the period of detention. His technical knowledge has been of significant strategic value. However, his continued existence presents a political and legal complication. He cannot be tried for war crimes because he provided his information in exchange for immunity. He cannot be released because the revelation of his cooperation would create substantial diplomatic difficulties with a defeated Japan. The revelation that one of their own pilots had provided military secrets would be perceived as profound national humiliation. Subject 847 must remain classified indefinitely. The report was filed. No copy was distributed beyond the 3 individuals who received it. No summary was prepared for broader circulation. The intelligence that Nishimura had provided had been fully extracted, analyzed, integrated into tactical doctrine, and implemented. His value as a living source of intelligence had diminished to near zero, but his value as a secret had become permanent. By 1950, 5 years after the war's end, Nishimura had spent more than half a decade in underground detention. Japan had rebuilt itself under American occupation. A new constitution had been drafted. A new government had been established. The world was dividing into Cold War spheres, and the war that had consumed the Pacific seemed increasingly distant, increasingly historical. Nishimura was permitted limited access to newspapers and radio broadcasts. He followed news from Japan with the attention of a man attempting to read the life he had abandoned through fragments of information. In 1952, Japan regained independence. In 1956, Japan was admitted to the United Nations. In 1964, Japan hosted the Olympic Games. Japan was rebuilding, progressing, becoming something new. Nishimura remained in the underground facility, aging, his memories of flight and combat becoming increasingly distant. In 1972, 30 years after his surrender, Nishimura was 71 years old. A new directive was issued from the Ministry of Defense. Files related to wartime intelligence operations were to be reviewed for possible declassification. The restriction on Weatherby's report, set for 50 years, was approaching expiration. A junior intelligence analyst named Margaret Ashford, daughter of Flight Lieutenant Robert Ashford, Nishimura's original interrogator, reviewed the file. She read through the decades-old interrogation transcripts, the technical data, the tactical analyses. She read her father's handwritten notes in the margins, observations about Nishimura's psychological state, his apparent remorse, his recognition of betrayal. At the bottom of her father's final report, a handwritten note in fading ink. Subject demonstrates no regrets about cooperation. When asked if he would make the same choice again, he responded, "I did not choose betrayal. I chose truth. That they are the same thing is the tragedy of war, not the tragedy of my decision." Remarkable perspective for a young man. Margaret Ashford brought the matter to her supervisor. The file was flagged for potential declassification in 1975, when the 50-year restriction would expire. The question was raised, what would happen to Nishimura if the file were declassified? He was still alive, still in detention, still officially classified. The decision was made at a level above her authority. The file would remain classified indefinitely. The restriction would be renewed. Nishimura would remain undeclassified, his existence unknown to the world, his intelligence contribution unacknowledged. In 1974, Shoji Nishimura died in the underground facility in London. He was 73 years old. The cause of death was listed as cardiac failure. His body was cremated according to Buddhist rites, a small concession granted by the facility commander. The cremated remains were placed in an unmarked urn and stored in the archive. The file remained classified. The intelligence remained unacknowledged. The tactical doctrine that Nishimura's cooperation had enabled continued to be taught at military academies and flight schools, attributed to accumulated combat experience and technological analysis, never to a single Japanese pilot who had surrendered his aircraft and his nation's secrets to the British in 1942. In 1995, 50 years after the end of the war, declassification procedures began for files from the Second World War period. Nishimura's file was scheduled for review. A historian named James Keaton, researching the air campaign in the Pacific, discovered a single cryptic reference in a declassified summary. Subject Kasuga provided technical data of considerable strategic value regarding Zero fighter specifications and tactical limitations. Keaton spent 3 years attempting to identify Kasuga. He consulted Japanese military records, British archives, American intelligence documents. Gradually, the name emerged. Warrant Officer Shoji Nishimura, the aircraft he had surrendered. The Mitsubishi A6M0, serial number 2457. The location, Pemberton Airfield, Unalaska Island, July 30th, 1942. Keaton published his findings in 1999, more than 50 years after Nishimura's death. The article appeared in a specialized historical journal, read by perhaps 300 scholars and military historians. It received no attention in mainstream media. By then, Nishimura had been dead for 25 years, his name unknown except to a handful of historians and archivists. In 2003, the complete file on Nishimura was finally declassified. The interrogation transcripts were made available to researchers. The tactical analyses that had been based on his intelligence were declassified. The full scope of his contribution to the Allied air campaign became, at last, visible to anyone with access to archives. But by then, the world had moved on. Nishimura had become a footnote in a historical narrative that had already been written without his name. He was mentioned in a handful of academic papers, cited in one comprehensive history of the Pacific Air War, but he remained largely unknown. The tactical doctrine he had enabled was attributed to the accumulated wisdom of experienced pilots and the technological superiority of American aircraft design. The human choice, his choice, had been erased from the historical record, replaced by impersonal forces and technological inevitability. What remained was silence, the silence of archives, the silence of a man who had lived in a cell, whose knowledge had changed the course of a war, whose sacrifice had been classified so completely that even his death had gone unacknowledged by the very nation that had imprisoned him. The war had ended in 1945, but for Shoji Nishimura, the silence had never ended at all. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video.